Hello again, book lovers. A History of Medieval Spain by Joseph F. O'Callaghan, which is still a set text if you're going to study the history of Spain in English, even though it dates all the way back to 1975. I should warn you, it's quite long and therefore comprehensive enough for the non-professional, I would think. I started reading this because I live in Spain and I'm interested in history, so that's logical, isn't it? I also remember reading a history of Poland and finding it interesting enough, but I didn't actually know where the places were in Poland, so they didn't mean a lot to me. Having travelled all over the Iberian Peninsula for the last 30 years, at least the place names were familiar to me. But it's surprising to see how much of the history wasn't. So this review will consist in things that caught my attention, basically. And if you want any more, you know where to find them. My first note says, obese Sancho went to Cordoba and came back thin. I can't remember the details behind that, but there you go, there's a little flavour of some of the anecdotes we're going to get into. Also, Mr. O'Callaghan draws on a lot of previous historians whom he quotes, quite rightly, and thereby offers a couple of perspectives. Surprising to me also was how much of Zaragossa's history I didn't know. There were so many battles between certain places in Spain and, in inverted commas, kings of Zaragoza that I'd never heard of, that I find it quite a surprising laguna. There was a battle in Barbastro, for example, which some consider to be the very first of the Crusades, where they tried to unseat the Muslims, and where, as I learned in this book, the French had a party for a year before Al-Muqtadir of Zaragoza finally came to conquer it back for the Muslims. But let's go back before then, because it's my favourites, the Goths again. We start with Swintilla, possibly the first king of Spain. That's a claim you can take with as many pinches of salt as you like. In any case, the Goths get a nice sweep through their history, how Recared had converted to Catholicism, the Suevi, the Alans, the Visigoths, all these tribes come flooding in. And as early as page 22, I was pleased to find the three cultures myth being hit on the head again. Mr. O'Callaghan's words, when talking of the Arabs and the Christians living together, says, quote, "This does not mean that they were revered, but simply permitted to exist." Good, that's about where it lies. So we get the Goths, a parade of long-forgotten names, and a long-forgotten part of Spanish history, in my opinion. The book is divided into sections of history, after which you will get a review of the law, customs, religion, social makeup, etc. When speaking of the Goths, we learn there are a lot of decalvations, which was a word that was new to me, and according to my research was last in print in 1700. Still, let's resurrect that one. Oh wait, here come the Muslims, 711 to 40, they're invading, and again we have this idea that the homogeneous mass of Islam came to fight the homogeneous mass of Christianity. Well, neither of them were homogeneous, of course. There was a lot of infighting, there were Berbers as well as Arabs. The Duero, the river, became a sort of no man's land division between Asturias and, to the south, what would be the Islamic realm. And again Zaragoza crops up as part of Islamic history, possibly why I hadn't heard of it when I was living in Zaragoza. And it has to be said, the Muslim invasion is not a simple affair. There are all kinds of factions coming in, being ruled or not from Baghdad or Damascus or wherever. All these revelations a little bit eye-raising to me, similarly to when I read Chomsky on the Spanish Civil War and wondered why I didn't know half of what he was saying. We read on and discover that Melilla and Ceuta were considered important points along the coast, well worth fighting for. Meanwhile, we get Alfonso the Battler, Alfonso I el Batallador, who has a statue in the big park in Zaragoza, and of whom I knew almost nothing until I read this book. His story's in there as well. And around at this time we get the division of Portugal, which was divided among the kingdoms of Leon and Castile by the traditional fair method of you cut and I'll choose. Now, I should say a word on the names here. There are so many Fernandos and Alfonsos. In fact, there's a chapter called The Three Alfonsos. Portugal's got an Afonso. I seriously would have followed this a lot better if, and I know it's a bit fastidious, but every time they named one they could have said of Navarre or of Castile, because it really was quite complicated to follow. Here, for example, we get the first rulers of Navarre, Aragon and Barcelona, just as a little taster. From the Catalan side, Ramon Berenguer I, whose sons were Ramon Berenguer II and Berenguer Ramon II, of course, the first of which spawned Ramon Berenguer III, Ramon Berenguer IV, and then you get Berenguer Ramon hopping in from the Provence side. His son was also called Ramon Berenguer, and so we go on, rather like Constantine, Constantinus, Constans, Constantina and all that in the Roman times. I wish they'd been a bit more inventive. Once again, we find out here how rivers are demarcating the territory. Very important conquests to make. We also see that people begin to state allegiance to the Pope, or not. This, to my mind, seems like a medieval version of NATO. From 1031 to 1212, Jews are forbidden to marry Christians, and it seems in every history we have to have a little smattering of Jew hate. At the same time in England we've got York and Norwich going on, so it wasn't just the Spanish. Juan of Sevilla actually converted in order to avoid being tortured. That's rather reasonable justification. And as we get in medieval history, lots of sees and their bishoprics. Good luck remembering that. Now, Jaime I comes along, and I noted here that in my head all the time I've been reading it as such, so long in Spain. Jaime I, to me, is Jaime I. He actually promoted debates between Christians and Jews, but eventually ended up banning the Jews in order to placate the powerful Dominican tribe. Around this time we get the origins of the transhumantia, the movements of the shepherds and the cattle, trekking up and down the Pyrenees where I live all the way down to Andalusia. And on the same page we get the possible origins of bullfighting as a result of this, spending so much time with animals. Christian missionaries are sent to Morocco when even St. Francis had given up on the Spanish Muslims. We get some mini-biographies of important figures of the time, such as D'Arnaud and Lull, and my favourite rhyming medieval, Hermann the German, who appears as the translator of Averroes, so we can see we're getting the Arab influence coming in here. They're bringing Aristotle to us. And the emergence of literature, poetry, chivalry is taking hold at around this time, which gives our author a nice excuse to include a poem in Aragonese, in Arabic script. A certain Robert of Ketton had translated the Quran back in 1143, so Spanish monks could refute it. And not long after, in 1197, Pedro II promoted the first law that allowed people to be burned for heresy. We learn about the rampages of what are called the Companyia Catalana, the Catalan Company, who were let off the leash and perpetrated some horrible massacres, tortures, rapes, the usual stuff over in the East, probably in the name of Christianity. And as we continue through the sections, each section opens with such and such a period was, more or less, marked by upheaval caused by internal and foreign wars. That seems to be a given, really, as you go on turning the pages. I learned about how Maria de Molina's death sparked anarchy, and some people set up communes in towns that defended her to fight in her name. Portugal united with England to strengthen its claims against Castile, said to be the first international alliance of all, at least in Europe, and that was in the late 1300s. In the background to all this there was piracy from them damn Moros. Oh, and also from the English, blockading ships in the Cantabrian and the Bay of Biscay. And a lot of colonial expansion is going on at this time. The Normans colonised the Canary Islands on behalf of Castile, I discovered. And Henry the Navigator, that great name in Portuguese history, only sent the ships down Africa. I thought he was on them. And in all these goings on, we learn about the terrible fate of Fernando, who tried to capture Tangiers, but was captured in this failed attempt. And as they couldn't rescue him, he was, are you ready for the quote, worked to death as a slave in Fez for 11 years. And that was a member of the royal family. We're getting to the end of the 13th century and we freeze the map here. We find the frontier lines are pretty much the same as they are today. A few things had to be sorted out, but the borders were more or less established. One other thing that I noticed as I skimmed through these old royal marriages, a lot of people seem to get married to their first or second cousins or even third cousins, which kind of leaves the door open to later challengers to the throne saying that wasn't a real marriage, or even to the monarch themselves saying I wasn't really married, so I'm going to marry who I fancy, etc. Around here we get sprouting up a lot of the institutions which we now have in modern Spain. The Generalitat of Barcelona could be said to have been founded on hostility to the Inquisition. And as we get towards the end of this rather long stretch of history, the Muslim kingdom of Granada begins to die. El Zayal and Boabdil being the last rulers who take their place in Spanish history as famous foes. There was also the idea here of a democratization of power in which people from the cities in Aragon, for example, would be invited to Zaragoza or Huesca, and there they would have council, but in effect people didn't actually like going, and there were a lot of questions about who represented who. In Mr. O'Callaghan's words, sessions lasted weeks or months, and in some instances in the Crown of Aragon even a year or more, but lengthy meetings seldom accomplished anything of importance and frequently were marked by quarrelling between the king and the estates or among the estates themselves. Well, how much we've moved on. The usual economic factors kick in as Flemish industries and English wool making threaten the Spanish trades at the end of the 15th century. And as an example of the Byzantine nature of politics at this time, let me quote page 629. A grotesque example of this sort is the case of Cardinal Jorge de Costa, a supporter of Afonso V, who was allowed to hold at one and the same time the archbishoprics of Braga and Lisbon, the bishoprics of Évora, Porto, Viseu, Silves and Ceuta, as well as the abbacies of Alcobaça and of 11 other Cistercian and Benedictine monasteries, the priorships of 10 houses of canons regular, the deanships of 7 cathedral chapters and other miscellaneous benefices in Castile, Navarra and Italy. From all these he derived a huge income which, yes, well, we can imagine. Having mentioned heresy, I should say it's about now that demons start popping up. The Inquisition mill is up and running and the witchcraft era is about to kick in. And the story draws to a close with the shift towards the state and the idea of todo por la patria rather than for God. And this particular story ends with the Catholic kings, Ferdinand and Isabella, which was where modern Spain could be said to have started. That was the expulsion of the Jews and the Arabs, and the discovery of America, of course. In fact, as you get to the end of the book, although it's been very, very complicated all the way through, it actually starts spiralling towards the end. And I think I have to dig in a little bit more to Spanish history of that era, as I found it all very interesting. And you will, if you're prepared to wade through a few long lists of kings and laws and bishoprics and things, a nice comprehensive riffle through that period in which I picked up quite a lot of knowledge. My last note, in fact, informs me that João II of Portugal enslaved the... Oh right, that's right, now I remember, yes. They ran away from Spain to Portugal for safety and got sold into slavery in Sao Tome by João II. The more you read of history, the more you end up thinking, well, this is a vale of tears, isn't it? But of course, we do select the tragic moments to form the peaks of our particular mountain chain of past events. I love it all, frankly. I have Mr. O'Callaghan's more detailed book on the Reconquista to look forward to, and I'm sure I'll be reading more. If you want to do the same, and have got the time, a history of medieval Spain would definitely be a good place to start.